YouTube, Dave here again. Today's video I thought I would just do another viewer question. It hasn't been the easiest week for me in terms of trying to get videos done. Mostly because it's been a lot of like ups and downs and fluctuations with the air pressure here, with wild temperature swings from like really hot to cold to hot to cold. Some days it start off cold and get super hot, or start super hot and get super cold. It's just been wreaking havoc on like my knees. Have been aching me almost every night, and it's been difficult to get some sleep. So anyway, hopefully next week will be a little bit better. Anyway, so today's video is another viewer question. It's on the subject of pet peeves, and I actually honestly thought that I had done a whole video dedicated to this, but as it turns out I really haven't. I've discussed some of these things in other videos, so I'm going to be sort of brief about them, but there are a few things that do kind of irk me personally, and some of them are ones that are serious enough that I will say something or do something about, and others are just like personal quirks that I tend not to worry too much about. So most of these are also going to be from the perspective of a dungeon master, because let's face it, that's pretty much all that I do. It's been 6 years since I got to play a player character, and that lasted for I think like a month before the adventure ended. So the first pet peeve, and one that I know I've discussed before, is looking over top of the dungeon master's screen, looking at their notes, looking at their maps, and looking at their dice rolls. That's something that is a big no-no. And there was a time where that would be like an instant grudge monster, because you just don't do that. The dungeon master has these things, behind a screen, usually for a reason. Now, yes, I know that there are some dungeon masters that will fudge their dice rolls and get their pet monsters to hit player characters, and there are adversarial DMs that will certainly do that. I'm not one of those people. If I ever fudge a dice roll, it's going to be in the player's favor. Like if I've got a relatively new player who, through usually no fault of their own, just the way the dice rolls have gone in the last several combats, keeps getting knocked down or knocked unconscious. If it might be looking that way again for, say, like the third fight in a row, then I will generally say either the hit missed or the damage that I rolled will go from like near max to almost minimum, just to try to keep that person in the fight. But it's one of those things that can be really irritating when you're making dice rolls and you see someone kind of doing this or looking back like that, and it's just it's a major no-no. And there have been times where I have switched up a monster's tactics to focus on the player who keeps trying to look at the dice rolls. And even worse, the dice rolls I don't really do too much, but if I have a player trying to look at maps, which I've seen a few times, I've caught them a couple of times, players looking over the screen trying to see the layout of the map, that will definitely cause sort of a grudge monster situation. And I have in the past completely thrown out a map that I had spent quite a bit of time working on, because I had someone constantly trying to look at it, and it's like, oh, there's a secret door over here. I think there's a secret door in the middle of this wall over here, even if there wasn't like a lot of secret doors in any other part of the dungeon. And it's like, that's kind of a wild presumption, unless you were looking at the map. Sometimes it can be obvious, but when I see someone doing this, and then a couple rooms later saying, I think there's a secret door here, in the one room in the dungeon that has a secret door, it has caused me to completely change up maps on the fly, and again throw out a map that I spent hours working on. So just one of those things that, again, it's a really big source of irritation, and I don't see any reason why a player should ever be craning their necks to look over a dungeon master screen. So stop it. The next thing is trying to metagame monster stats. It's one of those things that I do find to be very irritating. My least favorite question of all time when running a game is, how many hit points does this thing have left? Because I will never give you an answer to that. Ever. I have never said it's got like 5 hit points left. Now, I shouldn't say necessarily never. If something gets reduced to 1 hit point, I might laugh or kind of think it's funny and then just say, but even then I'll usually say, well, as soon as somebody hits, it's like, yeah, it had 1 hit point left, so don't bother rolling. But if you just say, how many hit points does this thing have, or how many does it have left, I'm not going to give you an answer. And your character would not know that information either. So to just go there and say, well, I hit it for this much last round, and you hit it for this much that same round, and you just cast Magic Missile on it, and you did that much, that's not information that your character would have. If that's the way you want to play the game, then you may be more interested in stuff like tabletop strategy games, because that's something that those games usually freely do, is let you know how wounded units of our monsters are or whatever. But in the role-playing game, your character's not going to know that, and I'm never going to give you the answer to that question. I have, typically will do like descriptions of how a monster is behaving that will indicate that maybe they're near death. Like I might say that their movements are starting to get sluggish, or you can see that it seems to be struggling to catch its breath, or that it's bleeding pretty heavily out of various wounds, and again it seems to be slow to move or slow to react. I will do that. And even if it's like an inanimate object, I may describe like the way that it's starting to crack and how pieces of it start, chipping or flying off with each attack. But I'm never going to tell you it has 6 hit points left. And if I catch the players really doing that, then a lot of times I will adjust hit points on the fly. So for example, if I had 3 creatures and they're trying to, and I have a player that's trying to figure out like how many hit points they have, thinking that they're all going to be standard, I will take one of those monsters and reduce its hit points, and then I'll take another one of those monsters and I will raise its hit points, and not necessarily by an equal amount. I may reduce something's hit points by say 10 or 12, but increase it by 15 to 20 if the hit points or the hit dice allow for it. I will never go beyond the hit point maximum available based on the hit dice, but I will make those adjustments because, again, I don't like the idea of the players metagaming that heavily. Just, fight the creatures, and, if you think that you're close to killing it, then it's up to you to decide if you want to split your attacks up. But don't do it based off of, information that your character would never have, like how many points of damage have been dealt to the creature. The next pet peeve is, again, another major one, and one that I will speak up about if I find that it's happening, and that is one player or a group of players telling someone else what they need to do on their turn. It's one of those things that, it's not your character, so you're not playing it. And I've said that before. It's like they make their own decisions. You worry about what your own character's doing and not what this person wants to do. There is a fine line between talking strategy, giving advice, and then just flat out telling someone what to do. And it's important that you understand the distinction. So, for example, if there's 2 monsters left, and you think that there's one that you think is wounded enough that you can probably finish it off yourself, and you think that the other maybe big damage dealer in the party would be better off focusing their attention on, monster number 2, then I would say something along the lines of, hey, look, I think I can take this guy myself if you want to focus on that one. And, it's up to you, but I think I can take this guy on my own, so, you don't have to worry about him. And that's usually fine, because again, that's just simple strategy, and you're not flat out saying what you need to do. Now, if I were to say, you need to fight this because I'm going to finish this guy off, that's different, because now you're taking the choice away from the player, or you're trying to. And it's really just a matter of the wording. And there are times where it's not meant to be bossy, but it just comes across that way, and then I'll just, again say, well, it's their choice, right? It's their turn, so they can decide what they want to do. And, if you want to give them advice, that's fine, but let them make their own choice. Because again, it can really just be as simple as, I think I can take this guy, you focus on that, instead of, or if you want to focus on that one, instead of being like, I'm going to fight this guy, so you fight him and worry about him, and you don't fight this one because I got it. It's just, it can be a minor thing in the way that it's said, but it makes a huge amount of difference. And I've noticed a lot of times if there's a mixed group where there are a couple of veterans at the table with, say, a newbie who's just starting to learn the role-playing game, I find that all too often that newer player becomes 100% dependent on the suggestions of the other players. And so to me, it's one of those things that they're not learning for themselves, they're just basically taking orders. So there has to be a point where it's like you're offering advice is hindering their development as a player. So another one of my big pet peeves. The last major one is not looking up your spells or abilities before it's your turn. And this is something that happens way too much, and it can be really irritating. because it grinds the game to a halt. Now, it's one thing to say, well, I want to focus on what's going on, you know, during the fight before I get to my turn, but there's a lot of times where you know the players had this spell or ability in mind from the beginning, and then decides, and then finally, when the time comes, that's when they start to look it up. Like, for example, the player wants to cast a spell against a group of enemies, and they know that they've wanted to cast a spell since their last turn, because a lot of times they'll say something like, just wait for my next turn, it's going to be great. So then they're like, I cast this spell. It's like, okay. Now, as a dungeon master, I don't have the spells memorized, because I don't get to use too many of them, and most of the ones that I do get to use are pretty standard. So when you say, I'm going to cast this spell, I might wait for you to let me know what the process is, or I will ask the question, is that an attack roll or a saving throw? And when the player says, I don't know, it really irks me. It's like, at the very least, know how it's resolved before you even get to like the damage or whatever some of the other minor effects might be. At least be able to tell me that, alright, I'm casting this spell and they have to make a Constitution saving throw or a Wisdom saving throw or whatever. Or I need to, or I make attack rolls. So at least have that information, especially if you've known for you know, several other players' turns that that's the spell that you were going to go with. There's zero reason for you to not pick up your book at that point and make sure you have the monster description well. If you have access to spell book cards, then have those laid out, and with all of your spells laid out in front of you and not just in the stack with all the other ones that you're not using. So even if you're not looking up the spell prior, when the DM asks you if it's a saving throw and attack roll, you can just look at the card right quick and it'll tell you exactly what it says there. But you know, spend some time before your turn to look up your abilities, because it'll make the game flow a lot faster, rather than having it grind to a halt as everybody reaches for their player's handbook or Xanathar's guide to find the particular spell that you're trying to use. So those are my major pet peeves, and those are the ones that I will typically do something about if I notice it happening. But there are a couple of smaller ones that I usually just sort of let go. One of the ones that's really all on me is the way people handle their books. So there's been situations where I've seen people just take their newly bought player's handbook, plop it on the table, let both covers fall down, and start like smoothing out the spine, stuff like that. And that it makes me cringe when I see it, because I don't handle my books like that. But at the same time, it's their book, so I'm not really gonna, you know, get upset with them or anything like that. And it's probably totally fine for the most part, but I've had issues with some of my books in the past based on the way that people have handled them. So I am very, very careful with my books. And it's to the point where I'm sure the way that I handle my books is somebody else's pet peeve, because I will hold the book so that each of the covers is supported by like my thumb and my fingers, and the book will be sort of open more like this than flat out. And I know that probably drives other people crazy, so I'm not going to say anything about how you handle your book, as long as you leave me alone about how I handle mine, because I've put a lot of money into my collection over the years, and I just don't really want to see my books get damaged or run the risk of like the binding being... So, 'cause some books have had binding issues. I have 3 first print player's handbooks for 5th edition D&D, and there were a lot of examples of situations where the binding would just come loose and the pages would fall out. So I'm very protective of the way that I handle those books. One of which, and I guess I should explain, because one of those is my at-home player's handbook that never ever leaves the apartment. One is my traveling player's handbook, and another is one that I have for the players to sort of share amongst them. It has the most noticeable damage on the cover already, so that one's easy to identify, and I'm not as concerned about that one. But that's one of those things that kind of drives me crazy. Another one is when people will refer to gold pieces as dollars, and it's such a minor thing that I try not to let it bother me, but it's not the currency that's being used. Like, they don't necessarily use the term dollars for their stuff. So when I say, well, you know, here's, you know, 30 gold pieces, and they say, ooh, you know, I got $30, and it's just like, but typically I won't say anything about it unless it's someone that I know is saying it just to annoy me. And at that point, I will just sort of dryly correct them and say, no, it's gold pieces, it's not dollars. But that's just, again, that's a pretty minor thing. Anyway, those are really the only ones that I can honestly think of. But let me know in the comments below, what are some of your personal pet peeves when it comes to gaming? And how do you try to handle those? Like, excuse me. Are they typically things that are kind of minor, like calling gold pieces dollars, and you think it's best just to leave it alone? Or is it more serious stuff, like, you know, players trying to boss other players on what to do, or players trying to look over the Dungeon Master screen at their notes and maps and whatnot? So let me know what your pet peeves are in the comments below. Thank you guys very much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you next time. Take care.